So for the skull features, again, characteristics of the skull made up of 2 or more bones. You are going to be responsible for identifying the skull feature, and that is exactly how I will ask it on the exam. Or I can also ask you to identify the bones and bone features that form the skull feature. So we need to identify the thing and the parts that make it up. Now remember, you have to know all the bones, but you only have to list the bone features that you're responsible for on the exam. So as someone pointed out, because I don't have the list in front of me, the first one was the hard palate. The hard palate, as we talked about, is what makes the roof of the mouth or the floor of the nasal cavity, depending how you think of it. And so this is it right here. I could have an arrow pointing here on the exam and ask you to identify the skull feature. But I could also ask you to identify the bones and bone features that make up this skull feature. And how many bones actually make up this skull feature?
Would it be 2?
What 2?
I actually don't know. I'm just taking a guess.
Okay, well, your guess is half right.
Would it be the...
Well, if your guess is half right, then what would the right answer be?
Just 1. 1.
Because
4.
2 is half of 1. Remember, it's a skull feature. It can't be made of 1. It's got to be at least 2 or more. And if 2 is half right, I thought I heard someone say it. What is 2 half of? 4. There you go. There are actually 4 bones and bone features that make it up. So let's see if we can start easy. And I think Julia's got the right idea. Let's start by identifying the 4 bones. What are the 4 bones? Give me one of the bones that makes up the hard palate.
The palatine.
Palatine. Give me another one.
The maxillary?
Maxillary or maxilla. Excellent. So what's left?
The lefts and rights.
Bingo. Absolutely. So the 4 bones that make up the hard palate are the right palatine, the right maxilla, the left palatine, and the left maxilla. So notice this is made up and we can actually see the sutures there and there. And let's do the numbers. So right palatine would be, got to orient myself here. That would be 1 there. And that would be 2 there. And then that would be 3 there. And then that would be 4 there. Excellent. So we have identified the 4 bones. However, if on the exam instead, I had an arrow pointing right here and asked you to identify the bone and bone feature, what would your answer to that be? It is the right maxilla, but what was that bone feature?
Is it the palatine process?
There you go. Oops. Excellent. And so then this obviously is the left maxillary palatine process. And what are the bone features of the palatine bones that help to form this?
Palatine process? Or
well, right, it's the palatine process of the maxilla because it's what attaches to the maxilla. So it must be the maxillary process of the palatine, right?
No.
No, because anatomists hate us. So what do they call it instead?
The horizontal process.
There you go. Again, remember, these are the bone features on your list. How many bone features of the palatine bone are you responsible for?
1.
Just 1.
So what did it have to be? It had to be the horizontal process. So there you go. On the exam, I can have, and I'll do this one in blue, a big, huge, massive, that's not even big, huge, or massive. Let's do it this way. The big, huge, massive arrow pointing right here, smack dab in the center. And there are two questions I could ask. Identify the skull feature. And what is your answer?
The hard palate.
Palate. I could ask you, identify the bones and bone features that make this skull feature. And what would your answer for that be?
All four of those.
Right.
The
well, yeah.
maxillary and the palatine.
But again, so great question. A bone is, right, a structure. The feature, remember, is like the thing sticking off of it. So if this has some process sticking off of it, this thing that sticks off of it, a process is just basically something that sticks up. So this would be the bent process of my pen, right? If I had another pen with a bent process, that would be the bent process of the left pen. And maybe the two of them come together to make an arch. That would be my skull feature. And that's exactly what's happening here. I have 4 bones and 4 bone features coming together. The maxilla is this whole big thing. I think I closed it already. I did. Here, since we're talking about the maxilla, let's look at the maxilla. This whole big thing right here is the maxillary bone. Some of it holds the teeth. Some of it has a big space for the sinus. Some of it forms part of the nasal cavity. Some of it forms part of the cheek. But this tiny little piece that sticks out right here, this flat part that sticks out right here, that is the palatine process that helps to form the underside of the roof of the mouth, right? Here's the palatine bone. This whole thing is the palatine bone, but this flat part right here is the horizontal process. So when we look at the skull from underneath, and here, let's switch views. Here, I like this one because you can see the sutures a little bit better. This is bone feature 1. This is bone feature 2. This is bone feature 3. And this is bone feature 4. These 4 things make the roof of your mouth. Collectively, they are the hard palate. Right? This is the palatine process of the right maxilla. This is the palatine process of the left maxilla. This is the horizontal process of the right palatine bone, and this is the horizontal process of the left palatine bone. So on the exam, if I pointed at any one of those 4 things, that is how you would identify them.
Why is it called a process if it's not sticking out?
It does stick out.
Oh. Okay.
Remember, the palatine bone is like an L. The bottom part of an L sticks out. The maxilla has a part that sticks out. It sticks out. These things do stick out. They are processes. I promise you they stick out.
Okay.
All right. That's how the game's played. Does this make sense? No, excellent. That's what I love to hear. Great. Let's try a different one. What's next on our list?
The nasal septum.
Excellent. Nasal septum. Bony structure that divides the nasal cavity in half, right? Unless you've been snorting massive amounts of cocaine, you cannot put a handkerchief up one nostril and pull it out the other one. right? I mean, I guess nowadays you can because people have piercings and you could put it through the hole of the piercing. But back in my days, the only way you could do it is if you snorted a lot of cocaine. This structure that forms that midline barrier for the nose is made by two big, broad, fat structures. The inferior one, way down here, is the vomer. It's a big, broad, plow-shaped bone. And do you have to know any bone features of it? Did
No.
anybody present the vomer? No. So you just need to know it's the vomer. However, the second feature is this big, broad, flat midline extension that someone did present. What was this big midline extension that someone presented in the very first group?
Is that the perpendicular plate?
There you go. Of
The ethmoid bone.
So there you go. On the exam, I could have a big fat arrow pointing to this structure, and I can say, identify the skull feature, and you would say nasal septum, or I could say, identify the bones and bone features that form it, and you would say the vomer and the perpendicular plate of the ethmoid. Questions on that one?
Can you erase the highlighting for a minute? And is there something that separates them, or is it just
Yeah.
kind of a, oh yeah, okay.
You can see the little bit of the suture where right here, where they're separated from each other, or where they fuse
Thank
together. Suture forms. Okay.
Thank you.
Yep. Any other questions on this one? I think that one's pretty straightforward. The next one's a little tricky only because of names. What's the next one?
The zygomatic arch.
There you go. When I put my blush on in the morning to highlight my high cheekbones, what we're really talking about is your zygomatic arch. Your zygomatic arch is made up of two bones. The first of those bones is the temporal bone. The second of these bones is the zygomatic bone. I haven't lost you yet, but here's where things get tricky. Remember, a process is something that sticks off of them. This process here that I am highlighting in red is a part of the temporal bone. It is a bone feature of the temporal bone, but they name it based on what it attaches to. So it is the zygomatic process of the temporal bone. This is the zygomatic bone. This little thing right here, oops, no, that's not supposed to be red. That's supposed to be green. This tiny little thing that sticks out here is a process of the zygomatic bone, but this process of the zygomatic bone connects to what bone?
The
temporal.
temporal bone.
So it is called the temporal process. So notice the zygomatic arch is made up of the temporal process of the zygomatic bone and the zygomatic process of the temporal bone.
Because it wasn't confusing enough as it was.
Well, notice a lot of things have names based on what they attach to, right? Remember this round thing, let's change colors, was the mandibular condyle, but the indentation on the temporal bone is the mandibular notch. So notice the mandibular condyle goes into the mandibular notch. It's the notch that accepts the mandible bone, right? The palatine process of the maxilla connects to the palatine bone. So calling them the process by which they connect to isn't a bad problem. It's when they then throw horizontal in there that they like to screw us up. So yeah, things are often named by what they attach to or what they look like or something like that. So I'll get rid of the purples to emphasize that again. So again, on the exam, I can have an arrow pointing here, ask you to identify the skull feature. If I say skull feature, your answer is zygomatic arch. If I ask you to identify the bones and bone features that make this skull feature, then it is the zygomatic process of the temporal bone and the temporal process of the zygomatic bone. Questions on that one? All right, what's next?
The orbit.
Excellent. The orbit of the eye. There are 7 bones that make up the orbit of the eye. And I will tell you the easy way I remember them. The first thing is it's all about northeast, south, and west. What's this bone up here on the top? What bone is that?
Isn't it the frontal?
The frontal.
Exactly, that's it, the frontal bone. What bone is this here on the bottom?
The
Part of the upper jaw.
Is it the It's not the zygomatic, that's on the other side.
Yeah,
That's-
well, no, you're right.
Is it
Zygomatic.
maxilla?
Maxilla, excellent. So notice we got frontal. We've got, someone mentioned zygomatic. It's going to be the one here over on the side. And as you guys just correctly indicated, this one down here is the maxilla. Now, notice the medial part. The medial part, a lot of people want to think it's the nasal bone. Notice this tiny little thing up here is the nasal bone, but the nasal bone is actually in front. It's not the part of the eye. Instead, it's this bone here we were talking about earlier that has the hole in it so that your tears can drain into the nasal cavity. And what bone has the hole in it so that your lacrimal duct can pass through it, so your tears can pass into the nasal cavity? There you go, lacrimal bone. So if you can remember the 4 outside bones, lacrimal, maxilla, zygomatic, and frontal, then to remember what's inside, you just need to have ESP. Because it's the ethmoid, the sphenoid, and the palatine. I can show that to you here on the model. And notice you don't need to know any of these bone features. You just need to know the bones. This right here, right, is the sphenoid. And it comes over this way to there. The ethmoid is along the side here. And this tiny little bump right here is the palatine. I can show you two on this one, but I think it's better here. Notice this great picture from your textbook. This picture from your textbook shows you really, really nicely all of the bones. So we have the zygomatic, the frontal, the lacrimal, the maxillary, the sphenoid, the ethmoid, and that teeny little bit at the top of the palatine. 7 bones that make up the orbit of the eye. They do tend to meld into each other in the skull because they're all fused together. But notice as you look closely, you can see the lines of the sutures, right? You can see a suture right here. You can see the suture here. You can see where the 2 nasal bones come together. So the sutures are the joints where these bones are coming together. Now, some bones show them more than others, but yeah, the sutures are the primary way you're going to tell them apart.
And then I had a second question. So when we talk about bone features, are we talking about processes and holes, or does it include more than that in the features?
All of those things. Condyles, fossas, trochanters, tubercles, all of those things count. Your book actually has a nice table that talks about all the different names they use for bone features and what they actually mean. So you can tell the difference between a tuberosity and a trochanter and a tubercle. right? Because using those right names are something that's going to be vitally important on the exam. Because if you call the greater trochanter of the femur, if you call it the greater tuberosity or the greater tubercle, you're going to get that wrong. So absolutely is important to use the right name. And so knowing those definitions are definitely something that can help. Yeah, the lab manual's got great examples. Your textbook's got great examples. There, the Master in A&P, there's lots of resources you should be taking advantage of. All right. What's next?
The orbit
We did the orbit. We just did the orbit.
was the
Jugular.
Jugular.
Okay. Notice one of the challenges on this exam is going to get to getting used to being able to identify all the holes. Some of them become pretty easy, right? The foramen ovale is oval shape. The foramen spinosum is the tiny little speck holes next to it. Right? Foramen magnum, big hole. Right? So we have lots of things like that. But there also, and I'm going to purposely change colors for this, there are some holes that are skull features. These skull feature openings are typically rougher in appearance, like the jugular foramen, like the foramen lacerum. And the reason for that is they form where two bones grow together. Basically what happens, for instance, in the jugular foramen, which we're talking about right now, the temporal bone has a notch in it. The occipital bone has a notch in it. Neither of them by themselves form the jugular foramen, but when they grow together, lo and behold, there is the jugular foramen. So the jugular foramen is this hole that is formed by these bones growing together. And notice we see a nice example of this right here. They're typically much rougher in appearance. This is where the edge of the occipital bone is. And this is where the edge of the temporal bone is. And this hole in between them is the jugular foramen. Notice outside, it is right or inferiorly, it is right next to the carotid canal. But remember when we saw the carotid canal, we talked about how it tunnels through the bone this way. And if you notice, the jugular foramen tunnels backwards. So notice inferiorly, these two things are right next to each other. But when we look at the inside of the skull, the carotid canal tunnels through and comes out right here, right? That's the opening of it. And notice way back here is the opening of the jugular foramen, way, way down there. So they're much further apart on the inside of the skull. Where the carotid canal, and we can actually see that teeny bit of the opening of the carotid canal, where the carotid canal actually comes through is right at this rough looking, one might even say it is a torn or kind of rough edge to it. What do you think we call this torn, rough edged looking opening? It looks almost like it was torn, or one might even say lacerated. Oh, if only I had a list of the skull features in front of me.
We call it a tiny hole.
Nope. You can on the exam, you'll just get it wrong.
Lacerated foramen.
Foramen lacerum, absolutely, the foramen lacerum. Notice the foramen lacerum has this very rough appearance to it because it is where the temporal bone, the occipital bone, and the sphenoid bone all grow together. These, now we have three bones growing together to form this hole. And not surprisingly, with it being so rough and irregular looking, there's really nothing that comes through it. It's really just the way the bones come together. Now, as I said, one of the challenges is being able to learn to identify all of these things, but you have some things that are going to help you. And the primary things that are going to help you is that I tend to be very precise on the exam. On the exam, if I have this picture, and I almost guarantee with 100% certainty, this picture or something exactly like it is going to be on the exam. I may have, and that's way too small. I may have an arrow that points here, and I will ask you to identify the bone and bone feature. And even if you don't know 100% what that is, could the correct answer to that ever be jugular foramen?
No.
No, because the jugular foramen is a skull feature, not a bone and bone feature, right? The same way that if I point to this here, I'm going to ask you to identify the skull feature. All right. And foramen ovale is never going to be the correct answer if I'm asking for a skull feature, because it's not a skull feature, it's a bone feature. So skull features and bone features are not the same thing. So when I ask for a skull feature, give me a skull feature. There's only 14 of them you need to know. If I ask for a bone feature, just give me a bone feature. All right. So again, those differences in the names will help in the differences in the questions. All right. What's next? We're kind of out of time, but I want to go quick. I think we're done with the holes. I think, are we to the fossas? Cranial fossas?
Yeah, middle cranial fossa. I
Did
think.
your orbital fissure?
Oh, excellent. Yeah, I did. You're right. I did forget one. Ding, ding. There we go. So superior orbital fissure, remember, is the bone feature of the sphenoid bone. But notice where the sphenoid bone and the zygomatic bone and the maxillary bone come together is the inferior nasal fissure, inferior orbital fissure. So the superior orbital fissure is a bone feature. The inferior orbital fissure is a skull feature formed by the sphenoid, the zygomatic, and the maxillary bones. All right. Now we're to the cranial fossas.
Yeah.
Okay, so notice there are basically three indentations. One that's really superficial, one that's in the middle, kind of deep, and then the one that's really deep here in the back. One's towards the front, one's towards the back, one's in the middle. So of course, what do we call the one in the front?
The anterior
Cranial fossa.
cranial fossa.
The one in the middle then is the
Middle cranial fossa.
and the one in the back is the posterior cranial fossa. Three cranial fossas, and each one is basically comprised of three bones. What are the three bones that help to form the anterior cranial fossa? What bones do
The
you see?
frontal,
Frontal. Excellent. What else? What's this one right here?
is it the
Temporal?
sphenoid?
Well, the sphenoid. Yep, sphenoid's going to be one of them. That's going to be the one back here. And what's the third? The one with the big sail that points out at the top. Ethmoid. There you go. Someone wrote it. Excellent. Perfect. So those three bones, all right, 1, 2, and 3, the frontal bone help to form those. Oops, I got away from this. All right, I'll cheat. Perfect. All right. Three bones also help to form the middle cranial fossa. Notice it is the sphenoid. It is the temporal bone. And any idea what the third one would be? What's helping to form the lateral walls of the middle cranial fossa?
Is it parietal? That's not on.
Parietal, there you go. Parietal, excellent. And lastly, we have the posterior cranial fossa. And that is made up of the temporal bone. And because the temporal bone's below, it's got to be the parietal on top. And of course, what's the most obvious bone that's going to help to form the posterior cranial fossa?
The occipital.
There you go. 3 different indentations in the skull for holding 3 different parts of the brain, each one made up of 3 different bones.
Does the parietal bone not have bone features, or we just don't have to know them?
It doesn't have any bone features that you're responsible for. Every bone has bone features. You're just not responsible for them.
Got it.
But what you are responsible for the parietal bone are the sutures that it forms. It helps to hold the whole cranial cavity together. And so notice, I think we'll see it better from the top view. Let's take a look at the top view. Here we go. From the top view, we have this, oops, not quite, this suture, this joint that connects the frontal bone to the 2 parietal bones, right along what we would call a frontal or coronal section. So guess what we call this suture?
Coronal suture.
There you go. The 2 parietal bones are held together by a suture along the midline, right along that sagittal plane. And guess what that one's called?
The sagittal suture.
Sagittal section. Be careful with your spelling. 1 G and 2 T's. Right? That's more than 1 letter. That would get your partial credit. So 1 G, 2 T's. Excellent.
Just to kind of circle back to what we talked about earlier, that like T intersection, that's the soft spot of a baby's head where those come together.
The anterior one, and the posterior one is located back here, where the 2 parietal bones and the occipital bone forms. Notice it's got this upside down V shape, which looks a lot like a Greek letter. What Greek letter looks like an upside down V?
Lambda?
Yeah, good old lambda, 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 right? Good old lambda, lambda, lambda. I know none of you get that reference. Maybe a couple of you do. That's all right. But lambda. So this is the lambdoid suture, lambdoidal suture between the occipital bone and the 2 parietal bones. And then lastly, notice that we have this suture between the parietal bone and the temporal bone. And what must that one be? Squamous. Now, this one is a teeny bit tricky. The reason this is called the squamous suture is because what happens is the parietal bone comes down, and then it has this very big, broad, flat surface to it. The temporal bone comes up, and it has a very broad, flat surface to it. And these 2 flat surfaces form the joint. So that's where it gets its name, because, right, squamous means flat. However, the way I remember it is, if you think about it, all the bone features we learned, mastoid process, look at that beautiful styloid process right there, the ear hole, zygomatic process, mandibular fossa, all those things are down at the bottom. And the top is just flat. So the flat part at the top is what forms the flat squamous suture. So the squamous suture is on the flat part of the temporal bone where it meets the parietal bone. So yeah, to answer your question, while we don't need to know any bone features of the parietal bones, we do need to know all the sutures that it forms. And again, every single suture of the skull has a name. You are only responsible for these, what, 1, 2, 3, 4? So that's not too horrible. And just that easily, we have now done everything you need to know for the skull. We've identified all the bones and bone features of the skull. We've identified all the skull features of the skull. And that's all you need to know for the skull. That's it. That's all you need to know for the skull. So now we just have the rest of the skeleton. And again, remember the skull's 22 bones. So that means we only have like 176 more that we have to go, 178 more we have to go. That's not too bad, right? Excellent. Don't worry, we have all the way till March 11th to learn all this. That's plenty of time. Excellent. Hopefully you're scared, because if you're scared, you're going to be motivated to study over the next 5 days. So hopefully this helps. All right, excellent. Yep, time flies when you're having fun, and this is definitely fun. Spectacular. So again, I want to thank everybody who presented today. You guys did an excellent job. You set a nice, excellent high bar for everybody who's going to present on Tuesday next week. And then on next week, like I said, not only will we do more physiology, we will finish the rest of the bones and bone features of the axial skeleton, but I'll also assign you guys your appendicular bones so that we can continue to do the same thing with the arms and the legs. Excellent. Well, your headache, it's okay if you have a headache, because the good news is you're done for the week. You're welcome to take the rest of the week off. You don't have to come to school again until Tuesday. All right. All right. Any questions on any of that? All right, guys. Excellent. Well, then have a good weekend. Have a safe weekend. Be smart. Be safe. Listen to the doctors. Wear your masks. Do all of those important things. Scientists know best. All right. I will talk to you guys later. Be safe and see you next week.